Latter-day Peace Studies is produced by peace-loving members of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Any views expressed herein are not to be taken as official positions of the Church or its authorities.
Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. I'm Shiloh Logan.
And I'm Ben Peterson.
Thank you for joining us as we discuss this week's reading of Come Follow Me, as outlined by The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're recording these podcasts from our homes, and so you'll often hear children playing, dogs barking, and babies crying. This is our life, and we love it. Our hope is that as we discuss these scriptures and truths, we will come to a more perfect understanding through experiencing the atonement of Jesus Christ and find greater peace in our lives. All right, Ben. Well, hey, I am back. I've been gone for 2 weeks, and
You're alive.
I'm alive. So thank you, Christopher, for stepping in. He stepped in on short notice, and it's been a crazy 2 weeks. But man, I loved listening to what you and Christopher had to say, and yeah, really glad to be back today.
Yeah, good to have you. Missed you.
Well, here we go. So today we are covering section 115 through 120, and this is a really interesting part of church history, because this is when we actually begin to get the persecutions in Missouri that culminate in the Extermination Order. And this is when the history of that all kind of starts to come together, because
very defining moment here.
Yeah, it is. Because in 1834, well, I guess going back a little bit of history, but in 1834 is when the Saints experienced the first being kicked out, right? The first removal from Jackson County. And then they went up to Clay County, which is north of Jackson County. And the people of Clay County are like, you can't stay here forever. So they ended up creating a county just for the Saints, just east of Clay County. And they called it Caldwell County, right? And this is where Far West is at. And this is where the Saints had been gathering. And the deal here is that, hey, we'll give you guys your own county so long as you don't go outside of your county. So as everybody, all the Latter-day Saints, all these Mormons are coming in, you just settle in this area. And for the most part, for the next couple of years, they did that. And all of a sudden, the Saints, they started getting along with their neighbors. And there was a lot of stuff that they were getting along with. And there was some trade that they were doing, and people started opening up to them credit, and they started to be friends with their neighbors, the Missouri neighbors, and things were actually pretty okay for them for the most part between 1835, 1836, and 1837. But what happened is there's this thing that happens at the end of 1837 where Joseph and the Saints in Kirtland are kicked out of Kirtland, right? They're displaced out of Kirtland. So that's the second displacement in church history. And where are they going to go? Well, the Lord's, you go to Far West. And so now Far West is now seen as the new gathering place. They can't go down to Jackson County. Adamon-Diamond is north of Clay County in Davies County, and they're technically not supposed to be up there. As per this agreement that they have, they're only going to stay in Caldwell County, but they end up having this little settlement up there that they call Diamond, or Adamon-Diamond, which we're going to read about today. And that's where the other settlement is outside of Caldwell. Well, as new immigrants start coming down, they start to actually form settlements and little boom towns outside of Caldwell County. And this becomes one of the first catalysts for why the Missourians start to come against the Mormons again, right? And so we're going to get into a little bit of that. But this history is important to understand, because once we, in section 115, where we start talking about Far West and about the importance of Far West, and then we start getting into the section 117, which talks about Newell K. Whitney and about Willie Marks. There were several saints who had not sold all of their lands in Kirtland yet to be able to finance and to come to gather in Far West. And so there's a lot of holdouts in Kirtland. And so this becomes an issue. They need to make sure that all the saints are gathering. So Joseph is trying to figure out how we best do this. He gets the revelation. That's 117. And then we end up with 118 and 119. And 119 specifically ends up being this message about tithing. And as we'll talk about, we'll open up more of a discussion. Tithing, it seems to be that there's this intent with tithing, number one, to help finance the church and help finance the building of a temple and help finance the getting rid of the debt. But they're also trying to incorporate this into a new modality of religious experience where they're making the ground itself sacred. Because we have to kind of recognize that they've been displaced now twice. Once out of Jackson, once out of Kirtland. And they're not excited to ever have this happen again. In fact, we're going to talk today about two sermons in particular that Sidney Rigdon gave. One's called the Salt Sermon, and the other one's called his extermination talk, or it's his July 4th talk of 1838. And these two talks are actually, this is where the conversation gets tricky, because a lot of the, growing up in the church, we hear the narratives of the persecutions of the saints. And we tend to have more of this, what's called like a hagiography, or like a telling of the saints' stories where they did nothing wrong, right? Where everything that ever happened to them was completely unjust, unwarranted, and everyone just hated them for their religion. When the truth of the matter is it's a lot more complicated, right? As most things usually are. And so what we're going to be talking about today is it's going to seem a little bit more on the other side of the debate on everything that the church did wrong, but that's really because there's very few voices out there that are actually giving both sides of the story. And so, what I intended to do is see if we can give a little bit more side to the other side of the story, the Missourians' side of the story at least, in showing what they were doing to make sense out of this. And
better context.
Better context, right? So I just want to give that in advance, because as we get talking, I don't want it to look like we're just completely on one side, saying really bad things, just because it needs to be more fair and balanced. And for time's sake, we could take many hours and then give both sides of the story and give a lot of context, or we can kind of show what was going on and then leave it up to the listener to then go read more hagiographies or more texts from the church that give a more one-sided version of the church's story, right? So with 119, it's that this tithing seems to be given as their attempt to relocate, resettle, get regrouped in far west, and then focus on making everything sacred again. They just had built the temple in Kirtland. They'd had experiences with that. Now they're gathering in Missouri, and they're trying to kind of regroup, reform, and make new experiences where they're at there. So that's really kind of the idea that frames these few sections. But getting into section 115, there are a couple things that stood out to me. Number one, Ben, this is where they start to. This is the official name of the church now.
Right.
Right. So we've had a couple different names of the church here. From 1829 until 1834, the name of the church was just the Church of Christ. So that was the official name. This is a
fully fleshed out name of the church, right? Kind of had sort of framed names of the church before, but this is, the more fully constructed. It's almost like, we talked about in previous sections where the idea of building the temple was this symbolic representation of how the saints were supposed to construct this community and dedicate it to God, right? And that was them, and the temple was this physical manifestation of that. And like we could even look at the name of the church this way, that over time they kind of change the name from time to time, and it's almost like here they've kind of decided, okay, this is the fully fleshed out name of the church. This is the completed version of what it's supposed to be, almost.
Right. Yeah. So the first name is the Church of Christ. It's very simple. It's very succinct. Mm-hmm. And then the next phase, the next roll along, is from 1834 to 1838. And then it's known as the Church of the Latter-day Saints. Mm-hmm. And so that's really the next name. The church goes through two more evolutions, and from here in section 115, this is where we get the third step, where this is where we finally have the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But there's a special spelling here, and it actually doesn't appear in our scriptures. So what appears in our scriptures right now is actually the 1851 to latter rendition. But from 1838 until 1851, there was a special designation there where it says Latter Day. In the current version, in the one that comes from 1851, day is lowercase, or the D in Latter-day is lowercase, and it's hyphenated. So it's latter hyphen day, lowercase D day saints. But from 1838 to 1851, it was capital latter space capital day. Sorry, capital D day.
Yeah.
I'll get this right. And so it was really because there were so many breakoffs that after Joseph had died that had claimed the title of Latter-day Saints that they wanted to be able to make a special designation for themselves, right? As the church. So what we see here in section 115, verse 4, it says, "For thus shall my church be called in the last days, even the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints," with latter day with a hyphen in the lowercase d. So, and that's what we,
which is grammatically more correct anyway, right?
See, we'll get we'll finally
because
get
Joseph
there,
Smith is all concerned about grammar.
He was obviously it was his number one concern at all times. Right?
Yeah.
But Ben, you had said something here about verse 7. It said, "Let the city far west be a holy and consecrated land unto me, and it shall be called most holy, for the ground upon which thou standest is holy ground." Now, do you think this is an objective statement, that the ground was objectively holy, that it was like it had been made objectively holy and was before all ends of the earth? Or do you think, for you, is this more something that the saints come and in their experience and what they do kind of make it holy to them?
So I think it could be either way. And I think it could be either way depending on what meaning the individual needs to pull from this. But what I see here is that, you talked about how the saints had been chased from, one place to another, or kicked out of one place to another. And each place that they were in, there was a story behind that place, right? Jackson County was supposed to be Zion, right? And so there was all these contexts and stories behind these places that were supposed to be holy. Now that they're in this place, this is getting called Adamon Diamond, right? We're going to see in the next section here. This is proto all the way back to Adam, right? Where we are taking back our heritage and what we are supposed to inherit as part of Adam's descendants, right? This is going back to the earliest authority that we can go to in biblical history and claiming that and saying we inherit this land. Like this is a super strong claim, right?
Right.
And there's a lot that could be discussed about that. Like as the saints at the time, I think certainly believed that this was literally geographically, metaphysically, or not metaphysically, physically, the location where Adam lived, right? That's certainly the narrative even today in the church. But I don't think it has to be understood that way. And there's many reasons for that. I think that was given to them as a way to look at the place where they were, and sort of a mode that you talk about by way of them understanding what their inheritance was supposed to be, and that this land the Lord had prepared for them, and they tied it to that physical geographic location. But multiple times throughout this, as we're going to see in these sections, is that the Lord actually isn't overly concerned with a specific geographic location being the end-all be-all. He can make whatever place they settle in Zion. He can make whatever place they settle in holy. And that's actually what I think verse 7 is saying. You've chosen to be here, and you have sacrificed a lot to come here and unite as a people. And if you're united and you start building Zion, the land where you stand is holy. And so I see this, for the ground upon which thou standest is holy. And I kind of wrote in the margin, whatever ground. You can make the place where you are holy by virtue of the fact that you are seeking a relationship with God. You have these covenants that are based on commandments, and that's all tied to the land. We're going to get into like the tithing thing and everything. And that's where I think that concept comes in, is that we make a holy space. And by virtue of the fact that we have decided that's it, the Lord kind of comes and says, stamp of approval, so to speak. It really goes along with the concept of sacrifice, like we're going to get in with tithing, because sacrifice means to make holy. But often we look at sacrifice as this idea that we're like giving something up, that we can't have it anymore. But if we're making something holy, ultimately it's not things that are holy, right? These are just symbolic representations of us. So it's a part of us that we give to the Lord. And the Lord really wants our whole heart. But in a symbolic way, he'll settle for a part of us. And so that's what sacrifice is. We give it to the Lord. And from sort of an epistemic standpoint, we view it as giving something up. But the Lord wants us to view it as giving it to him so that we can come into a relationship with him wherein he can tell us that we haven't lost anything whatsoever and that we only have everything to gain because we are his children, right?
Yeah.
So I think here, again, with this concept of the ground upon which thou standest is holy, you've made it holy because of who you are.
I like that. I don't even know if I have anything to follow up. I've been listening to them. I'm going to think, there's a lot of things here I'm going to think about.
I'm going to go back to these verses 5 and 6 here. Verily I say unto you, arise and shine forth, that the light may be a standard for the nations. So there's some Sermon on the Mount talk there, right? City on a hill type of stuff. And that the gathering together upon the land of Zion and upon her stakes, again, this is not a specific land, because, the early saints seemed to think it was at some point. When Zion's camp is marching back, they're going to go redeem Zion. They think we're talking about the land, right? Well, then they say, well, Zion goes over here, and then Zion goes over here, and they kind of come to this realization that it doesn't have to be like a specific piece of land, right? We're talking about the pure in heart. We're not talking about a land, but you can settle in that land and call it Zion in a symbolic gesture about who the people are, after who the people are, right? So, upon the land of Zion and upon her stakes may be for a defense and for a refuge from the storm and from wrath when it shall be poured out without mixture upon the whole earth. So, several years ago, there was a talk given by Elder Kieran in General Conference titled this Refuge from the Storm. And his discussion was about the refugees, the tens of millions of refugees that there are throughout the world. And in just this past conference, there was another talk given by Sister Eubanks from the Relief Society that kind of touched on the concept again. I thought it was interesting that she mentioned there were over 80 million refugees now in the world, especially now that we consider what's going on in Afghanistan. So Elder Kieran especially, and then this was kind of taken institutionally as a church and run from there, has taken this verse for our day and said, one of the main purposes of Zion is to provide a refuge from the storm. And literally that's what refugees are, those seeking refuge. And is Zion not the ones to provide that? Should Zion not be the ones that provide that refuge from the storm? It's very ironic considering the condition, the state that the saints are in at this time, because they are the refugees, right? They're running from place to place. And so they feel like they're supposed to find a land that can be their refuge. And to pull that forward to today and say that, well, Zion isn't just a place where you find refuge as a people. It's a place where you provide refuge as a people for others who are fleeing.
Yeah. Yeah, again, I don't want to transition because I know what I'm going to transition to, but I don't want to transition to that, but I don't have anything to say. We did I'm thinking years back when we were recording a podcast for LDS Liberty about the refugees. And at that time, it was about the Syrian refugees and about our responsibility there and the responsibility we have to being our brother's keeper, to use the Cain analogy. And, that episode, I still think back to that episode. And anybody can go look it up. If you go on ldsliberty.org and go to the podcast, I think they should still be up if you ever wanted to take a look at them. But, talking about that, especially Elder Kieran, I remember when Elder Kieran gave that talk in conference where he talked about the refugees. And President Uchtdorf stood up directly afterwards. And you could tell he was visibly emotional about that talk with tears in his eyes. And I've thought about that experience quite a bit, going back to Elder Kieran's talk. And I would highly suggest, I've gone back to Elder Kieran's talk many, many times about refugees, and it's an absolutely beautiful talk. As we transition here in section 115 of verse 8, it says, "Therefore I command you to build a house unto me for the gathering together of my saints, that they should worship me." So here we have the call to build another temple, right? So we're going to start to build another place where they can come in to worship and to lay the groundwork and to prepare for it. And it says in verse 10, "And let the beginning be made on the 4th day of July next, and from that time let my people labor diligently to build a house unto my name." All right, so this is in 1838. The saints are going to be kicked out of the state in October. So here we have that this is being given in April 26th, and towards the end of October is when the Extermination Order is going to be put into gear, and they're going to be kicked out of the state. So the question is man, what happened? all of this history, what happened in these few short months that caused all of this to go on, and that never let this particular commandment come to fruition in Far West?
Well, and the cornerstones are still there in Far West, right?
Yeah.
I don't think I've actually been to that, but I've seen the pictures. Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, it'll be fascinating to see what happens there in the future, and to see what course the church takes and when. But I think it's interesting here that it mentions July 4th, because that's a historically significant date for a completely different reason, and one that actually brings in a lot of context to why the saints were kicked out of Missouri. So first off, what happened so this is on April 26th when this section is given, when 115 is given. However, on June 17th of that year, so just a few months later, Sidney Rigdon, who had been displaced from Kirtland, was obviously upset. That had been his home for a very long time, even before Joseph had come there. And that's where he had his congregation as a Methodist. Sidney's obviously upset. Joseph is obviously upset. They've been kicked out twice now, as I've said a few times. And so a lot of their rhetoric during this time was very militant. It was very absolutist. And also during this time, they had started to have a few internal problems, and there had been a few dissenters. And of those dissenters were Oliver Cowdery and even of David Whitmer. So two of the three witnesses at this point were dissenters. And the issue that they were having was that Oliver Cowdery had written in January 21st of 1838 that he was very troubled, and had been very troubled for almost a year and a half, over the Fanny Alger incident. Because and Fanny Alger is a really controversial figure, and everyone has really strong opinions in church history, and it depends on where you fall. The original source documents and the primary sources that we have on it are rather interesting. They're primarily from William McClellan, who by the time he started to write about it, or to write letters to Joseph Smith III, who's the Joseph Smith's son, who later started the Reorganized Church. A lot of the story from Fanny Alger we have from William McClellan's letters to Joseph Smith, telling Joseph Smith III to go talk to his mother about this alleged affair that Joseph had had with Fanny. So what had happened, though, is from the Mormon side of it, from the Latter-day Saints side of it, Joseph had approached Levi Hancock, who was Fanny's uncle, and Fanny was living with Joseph and Emma at the time as kind of like a nanny, a housekeeper and nanny, and Emma liked her very much and was very friendly to her. And Joseph had approached Levi Hancock to talk to her parents to ask if she would be his first polygamist wife. And so Levi says he goes over to talk with the father, and the father says, well, whatever the mother says, and the mother says, well, whatever Fanny says, and then Fanny says, well, yeah, I'll go ahead and do it. So Fanny agrees. From Levi Hancock's perspective, and from what Joseph had said, and what kind of became later the church narrative, is that Fanny agreed to be his first polygamous wife. And this is where the story kind of gets a little bit crazy, because Willie McClellan ends up writing in one of his letters that in 1847, he said that he talked with Emma about this incident, and that Emma had said that she had basically walked in on this whole thing happening. Right. So to quote Willie McClellan, he says that one night Emma missed Joseph and Fanny Alger. She went out to the barn and saw him and Fanny in the barn together alone. She looked through the crack and saw the very transaction. She told me this story was true. She told me this story too was verily true. And so from the LDS side of it, the story is told that the very act, this transaction that Emma saw, was Joseph being married to Fanny. But there's also another side of that that some scholars say, well, no, it wasn't the marriage, it was the consummation of the act, or it was the affair that she saw, because they focus on the word they were together alone. So scholars are on two sides of this, depending on if they're kind of apologists for the church or if they're not. And then Oliver picks up on this. And Oliver is actually quite upset, and Oliver thinks it's an affair. He doesn't buy into the whole polygamy thing. So he ends up writing January 21st of 1838, where he says, I did not fail to affirm what I had said was strictly true. Basically, that this was a dirty, nasty, filthy scrape. And where he said scrape, he actually crossed it out and then wrote on top of it, affair. So it was a dirty, nasty, filthy affair. So this is why Oliver and David Whitmer, who are now living up in, I believe they're living up in Adirondack at the time, they don't think that Joseph has done the proper penance. Joseph is claiming that it was a marriage. They think it was an affair, and so this is the controversy. And so when all of this goes down, now Sidney Rigdon is really upset, and they're trying to figure out also how to deal with Oliver and David, because there was a small group of people, including Oliver and David, who had actually sold their properties in Jackson County, which Joseph Smith had said not to do. And so it looked like they were spreading slander and lies, and they were selling the land, and so they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. And so all of this, how do you deal with the dissenters? How do you deal with the people in your own midst? So Sidney Rigdon stands up on June 17th, and he gives what's called the Salt Sermon. It's become known as the Salt Sermon, and it's where Sidney Rigdon denounces all of these Mormon, quote-unquote, apostates, right? And he compares them to the salt that Jesus talked about in the Sermon on the Mount. And he said, basically, if the salt has lost its savor, then it has to be cast out and trodden underfoot. But they don't really know what to make of this kind of threat, but he ends up going on to say, there are no threats from you, no fear from losing our lives by you, or by anything that you can say or do will restrain us. It says, for out of the country you shall go, and no power shall save you. And anyway, so Sidney basically says that they're going to forcefully remove the dissenters out of their homes and out of their lands and kick them out of the town, and kick them out from among the Mormons. And there's a problem to this, though, because it's a legal question. And the legal question is does a private religion have power to kick a private person off their private land? And so this is kind of getting into this question that a lot of times Americans are upset with what they think is Islamic Sharia law, where an Islamic community will enforce their own coercive law and punishment outside of the U.S. judicial system. Now, this isn't the way it actually operates, but this is the claim that comes against them, right? And this has been a hot topic over the last 20 years since 9/11 with Islamic communities in the United States. Now, that's not the way it works. And we did an episode on Islam and Mormonism for LDS Liberty to go back and to check on. There's a 2-part episode. It's really great with Christopher Hurtado. But here, what happened is that some of the Missourians caught hold of this Salt Sermon. And they became wary and worried that the church was beginning to use coercive means of disposing people of their property without the proper legal protocols being followed. Now, at the same time, there's also a group being formed they called themselves the Danites, right? Or they became known as the Danites. And it was really started by a guy named Samson Avard was his name. And so Samson Avard, there's been historical controversy is not the right word, ambiguity as to what and how much information Joseph had or how much influence Joseph had in the formation of the Danites. Different historians land on different sides of the conversation here. But what we do know is that Joseph was aware of the Danites. He did attend some of the Danites meetings. It was comprised of members of the church. It was not an official organization of the church, but it did serve for two purposes. Its first purpose was to make sure that it was kind of an extrajudicial arm to basically enforce morality in the church, to make sure that all the church members were keeping the commandments and doing what they needed to be doing. Or the Danites would come in and would do whatever the Danites were going to do, I guess. So it was an enforcement arm of morality and of keeping the commandments. Second, it acted as a de facto army to protect the saints from any kind of threat, so the members would not be disposed of again from their lands, like from Jackson County or from Kirtland. So they had those two functions. So acting in that first function from Sidney Rigdon's Salt Sermon from June 17th or 19th, I think it was the 19th, where Sidney gives a salt sermon, it's the Danites that then run up to go kick everybody off their land, but Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, everybody got wind of this, and they ran out and abandoned their land for fear of being killed or being physically coerced or beaten up or whatever might happen to them. So this was the first kind of real issue where the Missourians started kind of like scratching their head thinking, what's going on? Well, the second thing that happens was what has been called the extermination speech. And this happens on July 4th. So after the whole debacle that had happened with the Salt Sermon and the Danites and going up and trying to get rid of the dissenters and the Missourians starting to wonder, like, what is going on? We also have to kind of recognize here that there's a few legal questions. We may have covered this in a previous episode, Ben, so correct me if I've already done it. But there's a legal classification at the time between what's known as militia, vigilante, and mob. So these are like three legal classifications. Now, back before the Civil War, there was no standard U.S. standing army. Everything was a militia at the state level. But what happened was in the U.S. Constitution, as well as in most state constitutions, there was the ability for local communities to come together as an informal militia if there was ever an immediate need, until the governor or someone who had the authority could form an official militia together. And so that unofficial gathering to do immediate defense or to immediately expel unwanted people they were called vigilantes. So vigilantes were groups of official militia that had not been officially granted militia status yet until the governor had gotten around to it. And then there's this legal classification called mobs. And the mobs were just marauding gangs who had no vigilante status, no organization. They were just bad people doing bad things. Now, during this time of history, what's kind of ironic is that all of the Missourians considered their groups as vigilante groups, and they called all the Mormon Danite groups mobs. And all the Mormon Danite groups called themselves vigilantes, and they called all the Missourian groups mobs, right? and so they were they both considered themselves vigilantes of like having the authority to stand up to defend themselves, and the other person was the mob. And so right. they were doing this to each other. Well, this gets complicated because on July 4th, Sidney Rigdon stands up and he gives this extermination speech. It's been called the extermination, and he's actually the first one to start to use this word. And this is actually for Brigham Young, Wilford Woodruff, Orson Hyde, Jedediah Grant. They all later attribute this in later years as the catalyst of what created the Mormon-Missouri conflict and war in 1838 in October. Okay, so this speech was co-authored really by Joseph and by Sidney, and then later Joseph Smith is the one who says we need to disseminate this widely to make sure that everybody knows not to attack us and that we're really serious. So I'm going to read here a little bit in part from what this says. So this is Sidney Rigdon in his speech on July 4th. We take God and all the holy angels to witness this day that we warn all men in the name of Jesus Christ to come on us no more forever. From this hour we will bear no more. Our rights shall no more be trampled on with impunity. The man or the set of men who attempts it does it at the expense of their own lives. And that mob that comes on us to disturb us, it shall be between us and them a war of extermination. For we will follow them till the last drop of their blood is spilled, or else they will have to exterminate us. For we will carry the seed of war to their houses and to their families, and one party or to the other shall utterly be destroyed. Remember it then, all men. We will never be the aggressors. We will infringe on the rights of no people, but shall stand for our own until death. We claim our own rights and are willing that all others shall enjoy theirs. No man shall be at liberty to come into our streets to threaten us with mobs, for if he does, he shall atone for it before he leaves the place. Neither shall he be at liberty to vilify and slander any of us, for suffer it we will not in this place. We therefore take all men to record this day that we proclaim our liberty on this day, as did our fathers, and we pledge this day one to another our fortunes, our lives, and our sacred honors be delivered from this persecutions from which we have had to endure for the last 9 years, or nearly that. Neither will we indulge any man or set of men in instituting vexatious lawsuits against us, to cheat us out of our just rights. If they attempt it, we say woe be unto them. We this day then proclaim ourselves free, with a purpose and determination that never can be broken. No, never, no, never, no, never. Unquote. Now, on the surface, this seems like when we look at the Latter-day Saints and we think of the Latter-day Saints, we're like, they didn't have any intent to go out and to do harm. In fact, they explicitly says that we will never be the aggressors. But what this ends up translating to the Missourians who had learned to be at peace with the Latter-day Saints, as they start to disseminate this into the surrounding counties, all of a sudden the Missourians are like, what is going on? Because from their point of view, things had finally been at peace. Like the Mormon religious practice was not in question. It really had never anything to do with their religion or their beliefs. People thought they were weird. People thought they were fanatics, but nobody really cared. They didn't break the law. They were just going to live over there in their own county, and we can do business with them as long as they are honest and pay their bills, right? And so this was largely the Missourians' attitude at the time. But when the extermination speech came out, and all of a sudden they end up fixating here on the war between us and them to a war of extermination. We will follow them till the last drop of their blood is spilled, or else they will have to exterminate us. So this is not just coming
It's a little heavy.
It is heavy, right? And it's not just militia on militia. It's not just vigilante group on vigilante group. It's to carry the seat of war to their houses, to their families, and one party to the other to be utterly destroyed. So this is not just a standard speech of saying, if you come against us, we're going to defend ourselves and I'm going to kill you in the process, and I will defend myself and my life with your life. This is, if you come against me, I'm going to come hunt you down, and I'm going to come find your family, and I'm going to come find your kinsfolk, and I'm going to kill all of them, right?
It's pretty reminiscent, actually, of how Captain Moroni writes his letter to Pahoran, or not to Pahoran, to Amaron, right? Brother of Amalickiah. He's like, right. If you don't do this, then I'm gonna arm my women and my children, and it's gonna be a war of extermination. We're gonna come and we're gonna, blood for blood, and we're gonna invade and take you all out. It's very, very type of hyperbolic type of threat, right? Yeah,
it is. It really is. And maybe in the time of the day, they didn't mean it to sound like that, but that is very much the way it ends up sounding. And in fact, Brigham Young ends up saying that Elder Rigdon was the prime cause of our troubles in Missouri by his 4th of July oration. So even Brigham Young is saying that speech was what made all this happen.
Yeah, for Brigham Young to say that, that's quite the thing.
Right? So it's really from this point then that was what happened on the 4th of July. That was the day. That extermination talk, what became the extermination talk, is what we're talking about here in section 115, verse 10, where it says, "And let the beginning be made on the 4th day of July next, and from that time let my people labor diligently to build a house unto my name." Right? That was the meeting, that was the public gathering, and the celebration of being able to build the temple was the extermination speech. And they promoted it all over the place. Now, over the next several months, the Danites end up doing things they're not supposed to be doing. Little known part of Mormon history is that at some point the Danites will actually go through up into Daviess County, where Adamah and Diamond is. And in the middle of October, over 3 days of snow, the Danites kick out every man, woman, and child into the snow. Any non-member, they kick them out into the snow. They rob all of the Missourian settlers of their possessions, including some shopkeepers that had even given extensions of credit to the saints. They stole all the shopkeepers' possessions, and they took it all up to Far West, and they distributed it among the saints. Right? So we don't really ever hear that part of the story. And that really becomes the catalyst for that one, and there was another skirmish before that had happened, where the Mormon militia had squared off against the Mormon vigilante group, rather, had squared off against
where David Patton dies, I think, right?
Right. Yep. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so there's these two skirmishes. The Danites and the saints in Diamond ransack all of the non-members, kick them out. There's women who miscarry. There's a lot of travesties that the Mormons did to the Missourians in Far West, or in Daviess County. And then that's when the militia shows up in Far West. And that's when Joseph is eventually arrested because of that act of turning out everyone from their homes. So everything that had happened in Jackson to the saints in turn did that to everybody there in Daviess. And so finally it's kind of interesting, because when the militia came in and started to make an account of all the possessions that had been stolen, the saints there said, well, we didn't steal anything. We didn't take anything. And they said, and the militia's like, well, listen, if we come out here tomorrow, we're going to come house by house, and we have a documented list of everything that was taken. And if we find it, we're going to take you to jail, right, for theft. And the next morning, when the Missouri militia shows up, there's this huge pile of furniture by the bishop's storehouse of all the stolen goods from the Missourians by the bishop's storehouse. And because the saints had taken everything that they'd stolen and they put them in a big pile just so they wouldn't know who actually took it. Right. So that stuff is going on from time to time. But this gets into a lot of other interesting church history. Like, for instance, Thomas B. Marsh, who was the president of the Quorum of the 12 at the time. As it's told in Sunday school manuals all the time, he leaves the church because of what's called the skimming story, right? Because his wife was a part of the women's group who would milk the cows, and they would take the top layer of milk fat, that really creamy, tasty portion of the top of the milk, and they would take that top skimming off, and they would give the top skimmings to the people in need. And Thomas B. Marsh's wife was accused of taking the lower cream and donating that, and keeping the upper fatty cream to herself. And of course, she denies doing it. Thomas B. Marsh says that he sides with his wife, and that's why we hear over and over again from our Sunday schools about why he leaves the church. When in fact, the real reason he leaves the church is because as a Latter-day Saint, or as the leader of the 12 apostles, he's completely against the Danites from the very beginning. And he even ends up publicly writing a letter. I think it's with Orson Hyde. I can never keep Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt aside. I think it's, but one of the Orsons. He writes a public letter in the newspaper, and he denounces everything that the saints did in ransacking the homes and in doing all these things. And basically is saying there is a Latter-day Saint here who's not involved in any of that, right? And that becomes the grounds for his excommunication. But what happens is that years and years and decades later, as he makes his way to Utah and is rebaptized in the church, his wife has passed away. It kind of becomes this moment when the church can basically bring him to terms and to bear for his apostasy in the last days. And there's no direct evidence to show for it, but there's very much this flavor that he ends up writing a letter of an apology. Basically, I was wrong, I was an apostasy, I was darkened, etc. But the funny thing is that when he was talking about being against the Danites and not ransacking and not using violence, he was talking about the Sermon on the Mount. He said, this is not Jesus's way. And then when he started to talk against about the Missourians, he's like, we should love our enemies and go out there and to befriend our enemies and to get to know them and to suffer and sacrifice for them, right? Very anti-Nephi Lehi-esque. And so when Lorenzo Snow ends up writing about the follies of Thomas B. Marsh, he criticizes Marsh and as a man of apostasy because he sought to love his enemies, and he thought that loving the enemies he could reconcile himself with the Missourians, and how fallacious and how folly ridden was that. And so then Lorenzo Snow is the one who's like, he really apostatized because he was so ignorant because of the skimmings story, and that's the story that sticks, and that's what we get into our narrative. And so really, this is a very complicated time for the saints. There's a lot of people here who are very militaristic. There's a lot of people here who kind of, I really think Joseph and Sidney really didn't think that this would come. I think they were kind of chest thumping a little bit, thinking that they could really like show themselves as something bigger than they were. And that they could really, by doing that, showing a show of force or a show of courage or a show of power, then they wouldn't have to endure being kicked out again. But then everything comes and topples in on them in October. And then that's when we get the Extermination Order. So anyway, the reason why I wanted to bring up that history is just because by the end of section 120, the next section in 121 isn't until Joseph is out of Liberty Jail. Because out of this whole fiasco in October with the Extermination Order, Joseph is arrested and taken down. He's tried, and he's put into Liberty Jail, and that's where he spends the winter of 1838 and the early spring of 1839 in Liberty Jail. And he finally gets out in, I think we looked it up, it's April 6th, right? He gets out on April 6th?
Correct.
So just it's a lot of really interesting history. Now, as I said at the beginning, that's kind of the Missouri, that's a little bit more of the other side of the context. I'm not giving this as the whole story. There's a lot of the other side of the story here as well. But at least hopefully this kind of gives more of a balanced narrative so that from what you do already know, you can add this to it to realize that this wasn't as neat and cut. This really wasn't a religious issue. This was about a religious people on one side, and on the other side it was the Missourians wondering if this religious people were going to actually adhere to the law. And they both had reasons to distrust each other. And they both had legitimate reasons to distrust each other. But the Missourians did have legitimate reasons. And the Latter-day Saints did give them legitimate reasons because they weren't always perfect. So anyway, a little bit of context there in 115 as we're going through here. And because you can definitely see, Ben, as we're going to talk about here and finish this up, is they were really trying to make that ground sacred. They really had their mind focused to trying to make this a sacred event and to reincorporate their whole view of Zion. And to bring about that thing of Zion. But we also see the complication that a lot of these people, a lot of these members were very militant, and even Joseph and Sidney even fell into very militant rhetoric at the time.
Yeah, I really can't imagine. I've not experienced anything like that before. I can't imagine how I might react and what sort of trends I might get pulled into, or what sort of rhetoric might fire me up necessarily. I'd like to think I would act in one way, but it does really give some fascinating context to the very next section, next time that we're going to talk about, which is 121, which presents such a concept, an idea, an ideal, a narrative that is so different from what many of the saints at this time were experiencing or practicing, right? And obviously, we don't get history doesn't tell many stories about the people that turn the other cheek, right? They just don't end up being very interesting stories a lot of the time. And so even if this is a regular or common occurrence from time to time or in various places, you really have to dig to find those accounts, right? When you study history, what is it that history talks about? It talks about military conquests, political upheavals, state succession of rulers, things like that, right? It doesn't really talk a lot about, in general, history is always focused on those things. So it's always been fascinating to me to think, what is it that's really going on here underneath the surface? What are the meek of the earth really experiencing and doing at this time that we don't hear about because history doesn't really concern itself with the meek for the most part. Now, it's not that we can't find that sort of stuff. We can, but you really kind of have to dig for it and sometimes read between the lines to get it. And so putting all of that as a precursor to Section 121 really kind of makes it stand out in stark contrast of this is what the saints are experiencing and practicing, and then this is what the Lord is telling them about it. And I don't know how we're going to comment on that, but it's something that makes you pause, right, and sit with that for a while. I wanted to go just look at something that kind of stood out to me about verse 12, and it goes along with a theme that I've been developing over the past several sections, and it's this. Verse 12 says, "Thus let them from that time forth labor diligently until it shall be finished, from the cornerstone thereof unto the top thereof, until there shall not anything remain that is not finished." Now, obviously, this is explicitly talking about the physical building of the temple. But there's more going on here. Implicitly, the Lord's not just talking to them about a building. He's talking to them about their community, their people, the church, Zion, that they are to labor diligently until it shall be finished, or in another frame, perfected. What do we have at the end of the Sermon on the Mount? We have that verse, "Be therefore perfect." Okay, that's like the capstone here of the Sermon on the Mount, because it's like Christ gives this whole discussion and sermon about a roadmap to him and who he is and how he exists in the world, and then points to God as that perfect, complete, finished, so to speak, example. So I think interesting here, again, going along with the concept of the temple being this physical manifestation of what the people are invited to become collectively and individually, that they put their intentionality into this building, but then in a symbolic way, it's supposed to be representative of who they are as a people. And so this is where we could kind of pull a narrative of the restoration from, right? That it's this building that's being restored or built, so to speak, and that they as a people are to be laboring to build this, to construct this, to build Zion until it's finished, right? There shall not anything remain that is not finished, right? Just keep working on it. So I think that's all that I had to say about section 115 here. Did you have anything else on there?
No, but I like what you had to say there, just about about verse 12, about preserving. I think that's great. Adamondiaman, you had a few things to say about Adamondiaman. Christopher actually called me up here not too long ago talking about Adamondiaman himself and about the previous episode and about the name of it with the Anti-Nephi Lehis. So it's I
was texting with Christopher a little bit about it because there's some linguistic curiosities there. Joseph Smith is very, even by this time, he's very steeped in Semitic language. He's very interested. He's always been interested in Egyptology, right? I mean, from the time of the Book of Mormon, where the Book of Mormon is written in these Reformed Egyptian, right? And so this Egyptian concept is forefront in his mind, which is Semitic in origin. He studies Hebrew, things like that. So that we get these little terms thrown in there that seem to have these kinds of origins. And we're not sure whether these are innovations of Joseph Smith himself in order to present a concept, or if these are word-for-word revelations or not. There's a lot of discussion around just the phrase Adamondiaman. I see this more personally as just a way that Joseph Smith is trying to present a concept to the saints about the legacy of the revelation from God. And he's tying it all the way back to Adam, as far back as scriptural record gives us. And this is what, I talked about earlier in the podcast about what authority that sort of pulls into the discussion. For Joseph Smith to say, yeah, the things that I'm talking about now go all the way back to Adam. This is the original authority is Adam. It kind of reminds me of, is it John Locke's first treatise on government, where he kind of gives this premise that, Adam is the one that really had authority, but we've sort of lost the patriarchal line, so we don't really know who has authority, but it's interesting that Locke kind of ties this authority back to Adam. I thought that was kind of interesting, but it's a little reminiscent of that. Joseph Smith's kind of evoking this Adamness authority of the gospel, of the revelations that he's presenting. And so even the land is named after Adam, right? Where we're supposed to settle. And this is where God wants us to be. God wants us to be the people who inherit the legacy of Adam, all the way back to Adam. So again, going back to this concept, Adam ondiamen, the linguistically there, that preposition there, ondi or ondi, could be related to a Semitic term that denotes closeness or possession or adjacency to something. And so it's almost like we're talking about Adam being with God or God being with Adam. And it sort of evokes the Old Testament term Emmanuel, right? God is with us. And so that's kind of where my mind went on this, is that, this is the place where God was with Adam. This is the place where man can truly commune with God. And, symbolically, we look at this valley and they got to this valley and they were overlooking it from a hill and it was beautiful and they just thought this was great. Surely there's significance to this place, right? Surely this is a place where man can commune with God. Sort of going back to their mindset of the temple being this place that they physically construct, that's a place where they can worship and commune with God. So this placement was holy. And so naming it Adam ondiamen, where Adam, our predecessor, actually, physically came face to face with God, I think evokes that same concept there of holiness, and that man not only is seeking to ascend to be with God, but that God also is willing to condescend to be with man. And this is a place where that can be. So.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I was reminded of a verse here in section 51, verse 17. And it's one that my wife and I, that Rachel and I have used throughout our lives, especially when we moved so much. I think I've talked about it before, but until we moved to Bakersfield and kind of set down roots here, we'd moved, I think, 23, 24 times in 10 years, right? And it's just, that's a lot of times to move. That's a lot of awards. That's a lot of new people to get to meet. And so there's this verse in section 51 that says, "Let them act upon this land as for years." And for us, and the meaning that took on for us, is that we knew we were going to only be in some place for a short amount of time. And yet, let them act as though they were going to be there forever. Because when you're only there for a short amount of time, you tend to be like, I'm only going to be here for a little bit. You become a little bit apathetic.
You don't unpack all the boxes, right?
Exactly. and so for us, that was really a kind of a pull for us to be able to say, you're here. You may only be here for a few months. Live here as though you're going to know these people for the rest of your life, right? And so when I get into section 117 after Adam ondiamen, and we start getting into 117, 117 is this pull from, selling like, everything in Kirtland, we're not going there anymore. There's a story about burning your ships, but it's give up everything that's tying you to your previous life. And there's very much a metaphor here in 117 that I see, that there's so much in our lives that we want to hold on to, that there's beauty that's happened before. In a lot of ways, you see that in Kirtland, beautiful things happened in Kirtland. And beautiful things happened before they became members of the church. They moved there. They had these beautiful experiences. They had community. They were there. They had and formed these bonds with people, and people they would be leaving, right? And you can see, I can see how these saints would not want to let go of the beauty. And it's more than just nostalgia.
Well, they've given so much to build the temple. I mean, they're in their poverty, and they're still, they build that building and to leave it behind.
Oh yeah, even that, right? All of the sacrifice that they'd done as members of the church, and for those who'd been there before. And Newell K. Whitney had been there before. He was one of the what my kids would say, one of the OGs. he was one of the original people who were there. And now Joseph is like, let that go. And so as I've read 117, I've been thinking a little bit of what in my life do I not let go of? What in my life are there things that I find beauty in, that I have found love in, I have even found God in, but yet that God calls me into new things. And calling me into new things often requires letting old things go. And letting God be God. And in that way of letting God be God, trusting in that process of letting life take its course with God. And anyway, we have this verse here of Newell K. Whitney and William Marks being a little bit chastised because they haven't let it go, right? Yeah. And they want
to have their businesses.
They want to have their businesses. They want to have their lands. They want to have the things that they've worked hard for. They want to have those things that they've built to cherish, and the entire culture, everything that they are, everything that's around them that informs them about what their life is wrapped up in these things. And yet the Lord is saying, everything that you think you are, and all the successes and all the measurements of success, everything that you think has brought you to this point, let it go. And for me, this is very much the first beatitude of the poverty in spirit. It's the relinquishing of even the goodness that we think we've had in life. When God calls us into a new moment, to trust in God in that new moment. And because even though we've had moments of the divine, even though they had the Kirtland temple, they still needed to leave Kirtland. Even though they had all those experiences of what made them who it made them, and all of the suffering and sacrifice and everything, all of the experiences, the joys, the pressures, they had to let it go. And so what things in our lives that have brought us joy, that have brought us closer to God, that are no longer working, does God call us into something new and we refuse to go because we're holding on too ardently to the past? And so that verse came back again when you were talking about to live on the land as for years. And so here in verse 6 and 7, for have I not made the fowls of heaven, and also the fish of the sea, and the beasts of the mountains? Have I not made the earth? Do I not hold the destinies of all the armies of nations of the earth? Therefore I will not make solitary places to bud and to blossom and to bring forth in abundance, saith the Lord. Is there not room enough on the mountains of Adamon-Diamon and on the plains of Ola Sheneha, or the land where Adam dwelt, that you should covet that which is but a drop and neglect the more weighty matters? God is in everything in our lives. We learn in section 88 that God is in and through all things. In this, yes, God is in our past, but he's also in our future. And just because God has been in our past and has brought us through the things we've been in our past, it doesn't mean that we always have to keep those things sacrosanct. And when he calls us into something new, trust it and be able to move into that. Because if we hold on too ardently to the things of the past, we begin to idolize the past as a nostalgic experience. And even when we start to idolize those experiences themselves, as opposed to trusting God to bring us into new and yet even possibly more glorious experiences, because we're always living behind ourselves. So I think it was just, so 116 and becoming present for that was very much that looking forward with God, then looking back, because we can look back and see all the glories that God has bestowed upon us and everything that God has been with us, through the good and through the bad. But we don't necessarily have to take it all with us. we can let it go, right? And he even does say that in verse 5. Let the properties of Kirtland be turned out for the debt, saith the Lord. Let them go, saith the Lord. I think it's just a beautiful moment and a way to be able to express that.
It is. These verses from 4 to 8 there's quite a bit of depth there. And we could read them very superficially. He's always just talking about these properties. You need to sell these properties and come and live there. But there really is so much more going on here in terms of their hearts, because that's what the Lord's speaking to. You can say, what we really need to do is look at where your heart is. Is your heart in a place where these things don't have hold on you in that way? Covet not. Repent of their sins and all their covetous desires before me, saith the Lord God. For what is property unto me, saith the Lord. Right? He calls all of those things in Kirtland that they've spent all these years building up. Over in verse 8, he says, they are but a drop. There is a part here to verse 5. It says, let them go, saith the Lord, and whatsoever remaineth, let it remain in your hands, saith the Lord. That degree of surrender, it's almost, I kind of envision in my mind, someone opening their hands and closing their eyes, and whatever's going to go is going to go. And then you open your eyes and you see there are some things still here for me. And those things are still important. So whatever remaineth, let it remain in your hands. We've talked about this before, that often we do have to kind of step back from all of the baggage that we've built up around the very particular spiritual revelations or experiences, or whatever you want to call them, that we've had. That sometimes we really we pile a lot of stuff on those. We infer a lot of things, and it's really helpful for us to kind of go back to those core things and things that we've revealed, and kind of take off those layers, let them go, and see where those things really are. What remaineth, right? Let those things go. What remains? And at the end of verse 8, the weightier matters. The weighty matters, I guess you could say. I say weightier matters because this is an allusion to, is this not an allusion to Christ when he's speaking with the Pharisees and says that they neglect the weightier matters of the law, that they're more concerned with all of the particularities of performances and ordinances, and they neglect the weightier matters of the law. So if that we step back and really examine those things and see where our heart sits. This also makes me think of Nephi and his discussion about line upon line and precept upon precept, and that we don't assume that the Lord can't give us more just because he's given us one thing, that the more can't help to reframe and reinterpret the things that we've received before, and that we don't close ourselves off to that we can still respect what the Lord has given us, and and accept that he has more to give us, and realize that sometimes that more that we receive may require that we let go of some of that baggage that we have built up around the things we previously had. I know we've talked before about the analogy of a revelation being kind of like a hook on the wall, and we sometimes like hang some coats on it, right? and at a certain point, that hook or that shelf, so to speak, can't hold that baggage anymore, and we kind of have to clear. It's not strong enough to hold all that we put on it. It's not that it's not important, but we belabor it with too many things. And the Lord wants us to let that go and see what remaineth, like this verse says. I really think there's a ton here in these verses that is pretty profound about a very practical, real-world application of that first beatitude, right? It is beautiful.
Yeah. When we were talking before recording, you had brought up verse 13 when it was talking about Oliver Granger. Therefore, let him contend earnestly for the redemption of the first presidency of my church, saith the Lord, and when he falls, shall rise again. For his sacrifice shall be more sacred unto me than his increase, saith the Lord. That's an interesting concept.
Yeah, even in light of in this next section where we talk about tithing being a tenth of our increase, there is a broader discussion to be had here about sacrifice, and it's one that we've brought up before, that so much of our narrative around sacrifice involves us giving something up. And what's interesting about that is it's kind of fits into the Beatitudes, right? When there's that poor in spirit and then the mourning, the mourning of the loss. But then coming in to realize that there wasn't anything of value that was really given up, so to speak. It was more a symbolic, our giving to the Lord, our will. Neil A. Maxwell talks about this in a talk. I think I brought it up last podcast, where ultimately, there's nothing we possess that's property, is ours, so to speak. The Lord has provided it all. That's why he says earlier in this verse, what's property unto me? It's just a drop. But that we sometimes, are so fixed on that, as something that we're giving up, rather than realizing that the sacrifice isn't about giving up some material thing. It's about making ourselves holy. And maybe that's just an epistemic making ourselves holy because we're children of God, so we are who we are. But there is that realization in that moment of the divesting of that thing, and even a time of mourning, that we come to that realization of our holiness. And that's what sacrifice is. It's that realization, epistemic or metaphysical, of our holiness, I think.
Yeah, I like that. And kind of going along with that as well, the concept of tithing, I've been involved in more conversations than I care to admit about the history of tithing and about what it means to be able to pay a tenth of the increase, right, of how that plays out. And there's a lot of really great history out there, and this has never been my soapbox. So this isn't one of those things that I get out there and I study voraciously. But what I do wanted to talk a little bit about was tithing as a modality here, because I think that has a lot to do with how they're trying to make the ground sacred. So hopefully we can take the conversation that way. But I will say this, that the church website, there's this conversation about what does it mean to pay a tenth, right? Because historically it was on the increase that you had from the time before. And so if you had 100 sheep and then you ended up having an increase of 10 sheep, then you would pay a tithing on the 10 sheep. So it'd be one sheep would be your tithing, not another, not another 10. So it was the increase. So if you ended up having 110 sheep, so that's how that worked out.
Things have changed economically so much that, framing that in that way is more difficult. Yeah.
It's more difficult. Right. And there's a lot of different reasons for why we do this. And as I said, historians of the church have been all over this conversation. But the other conversation is, do you pay on 10% of your gross or do you pay 10% on your net? And to this, what I love is on the church's website. So if you Google, do I pay tithing on my income before taxes are taken out, or on what I receive after taxes? Remember that phrase, because that's what the article's name is. Do I pay my tithing on income before taxes are taken out, or on what I receive after taxes? But what it says here on the church website is, the first presidency has answered this question in this way. The simplest statement we know of is the statement of the Lord himself, namely that members of the church should pay 1/10 of all their interest annually, which is understood to mean income. No one is justified in making any other statement than this. From March 19th, 1970. Okay. Unquote. It says, in other words, the way you define your income, and consequently your tithing, is a matter between you and the Lord. Prayerfully seek the Lord's guidance on issues like taxes, gifts, scholarships, and other matters to determine what qualifies as a full tithe. Right?
Yeah.
Now, I love this because I do know that there are many local leaders that have very, very, very strong opinions about what constitutes tax, whether or not you pay before or after you tax, whether or not you do it on your gross or your net. But as far as the church is concerned, and as far as what they say, is that this is between you and the Lord. This is local leadership can have their opinions, but where it comes down to the church, it says, in other words, this is between you and the Lord. Pay the 10% on what you feel is necessary for you and the Lord. Now, that said, the modality here, I think it's interesting, Ben, because we're looking here at them trying to be connected more to the land. This live on the land as for years. The Lord is bringing them. Now, with the Lord's all-encompassing, all-seeing eye of God, he knows that in just a few months they're going to be off the land. So why all the talk about them building right then and there, right? What's that all about? And I think in a process, it's not about the end result. It's about everything that you do, live on the land as for years. And so no matter what you do it with the full integrity. And there's another, and I can never remember whether it's John Taylor or Wilford Woodruff, but I think it's Wilford Woodruff. And we have to remember is that these early saints were, militant isn't the right word. Rabid is a little bit... It's not even really the right word, but they were very millennialist. So they believed that Jesus was coming any moment, right? And so there was a moment when, I think it was Wilford Woodruff. I'll have to go find it. But he's out planting a fruit tree. And a member came up and said, why are you even planting a fruit tree when Jesus is coming so quickly and so soon? And his response was, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's, I live my life to be ready when the Savior comes at any moment. But today, I'm planting my tree. And so it's one of those things of living on the land as for years. To live and to be here and to exist as though we will always be here, but always be ready for the Lord to change things at any time. Always be ready for life to change things. And I have to get myself out of this way of talking about it too, as if God's the one dictating my life. He's the one up there with chess, playing the game of Shiloh chess, so like moving things here and there. I think
let's see how he reacts to this,
right? And that's the way that our culture, religiously and and socially and everything else, that's the way we think about it and talk about it. But in reality, I think life is just life. Things just happen because they happen, and God is in and through all of it. And so it's not that he's the one who's like making this happen and making this bad thing happen, because I think that's an atrocious way of looking at trauma, that trauma is God-induced, that these moments when we experience these things, well, that's just God doing that. I think that's a deplorable way of looking. I think life is just life, and we learn how to see reality and forgive reality, and then to exist in those moments, and God is with her in that process. Otherwise, when God becomes the actual initiator of it and the cause of it, it's just, that makes for some really, really crazy theology that, as I've thought about it for 20 years, it just doesn't really come to any really good fruit as I've ever been able to find. And
I think a lot of this discussion goes with the idea of just being, like that we're not concerned with whatever these external circumstances are that might need to change that might need to affect our mode of being all of a sudden. That's a very reactionary way of looking at it, as if we're supposed to always be responding to some external stimuli. Whereas, Lehi kind of puts it in things to act and things to be acted upon, as if we're treating ourselves as if we're just always things to be acted upon, right? That we wouldn't want to live purposefully, live as for years, as you say. But rather, we're the actors. We're the ones making things happen. And we're not concerned with a particular outcome, but we're also not going to live our life as if the outcome is going to be something specific that, we take into context the second coming, right? My thought when you told that story about Wilford Woodruff, because I couldn't remember if I'd heard it before. I mean, I have now, but I couldn't remember at the time was, why are you planting a fruit tree? Christ is coming. And my thought was well, you don't think we're going to eat fruit after Jesus comes? I think our day-to-day life, even if we view it in a very millennialist type of way, our day-to-day life, what is supposed to be different about that, right? If we're living today the path taught us by the Savior and the Sermon on the Mount, what's to change when he comes? That's it. That's the way. And so there doesn't have to be a change in our mode of being, so to speak, this dramatic change. We just are who we are. We're existing. And so, taking it back to this idea that we would somehow live or exist on the land as they are, anticipating some major upheaval or change all the time, it really takes our focus, our attention away from just living in the moment and becoming or being who we're meant to be as God's children. And it's kind of goes again back to the take no thought for tomorrow. Again, we discussed this. That doesn't mean we don't think about tomorrow. It doesn't mean we don't store food. It doesn't mean we don't, prepare for things that might potentially happen that could be disastrous. It means that we still take every moment of every day to live our life and find peace in those moments. And we're not constantly anxious about some potential upset of our of the status quo or of our lifestyle, right?
Yeah, I love that. And I love tying that back to the sermon that way. I'm gonna go reread that just with that in mind tonight. Well, Ben, do you have anything more to say about 119?
No, I don't think so. Oh, you were talking about, the statement on the church website about tithing and stuff. I think I would just say, there's doesn't seem to be any justification whatsoever for a church leader to go beyond the question that they are entrusted to ask, which is, do you pay? I don't even know if the question is, do you pay a full tithe or an honest tithe? Now I don't remember. I want to say honest, but either way, it doesn't really matter. Do you pay a full tithe? That's it.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the question, do you live the word of wisdom? Do you obey the word of wisdom? You don't get into these definitions because that isn't supposed to be the point.
Yeah.
But we make it the point anyway so often.
Yeah, I like that. And I liked when they included the, do you consider yourself worthy? I think that was really the ultimate question of that, and the answer should always be
I've said
yes.
before that should be the only question.
Right. And the answer is, as we've said before, that we are always already worthy, and repentance is the process by which we come around to that and to recognize that.
Yeah.
Because the actions that we take that we consider and call sin are simply the actions that we take in living in that false self and not realizing who we really always are. And so, yeah, love it.
In a temple context, we've talked about this before in terms of cleanliness, and how cleanliness in a ritualistic sense isn't the same as sin. It's more just like preparedness to engage in the mode, or preparedness to be in the frame of mind in order to pull the meaning that we need out of the mode that strengthens our relationship with God. So in that sense, we might even say not worthy, but do you consider yourself prepared? Something like that, I think really gets more at the heart of the matter for me.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at that. Well, next week we are covering section 121. I've been anxiously waiting for this.
This is the climax, right?
Yeah, this is, I don't know of a section in a group of scripture, on from 41 through 44 that I've quoted more from in the last year. Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. There's going to be a lot to say about this. So I look forward to next week.
Sure.
Well, until then, thank you everybody for listening, and we will see you back next week. Until then, I'm Shiloh Logan.
I'm Ben Peterson.
Thanks for listening.